really organize ourselves, we can do it at scale. And that's where we can have an impact, particularly on this issue of climate change, which is at the center of the COP27 that we are here today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So Nigel, from your perspective, EBRD works closely with the private sector, and you're working closely on cities and the climate change agenda. Could you share some examples of the outcomes that you've had in collaborating? We've heard about collaboration amongst MDBs, but collaborating with the private sector. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So, as Mike just said, you know, we here are like a team of organizations working on climate action in cities, and another part of that team are the private sector who we collaborate with. In fact, the EBRD as a bank, our mandate is mainly focused on private sector investments, and most of our investments across the whole bank are private sector. In the public infrastructure space, of course, that's more challenging. And about 35% of our investments are with private sector. I want to talk a little bit about what we're doing with the private sector in our Green Cities program, which is a program of the bank to foster climate action in cities, as the name suggests. One of the examples is here in Egypt, actually, 6th October City, where we have financed a dry port facility just close to Cairo, and that was through a public-private partnership. And I mean, this was, I think it was the first public-private partnership in the sector, and it's going to lead to something in the order of 40,000 tons of CO2 mitigated per year. So it's a significant project, and that was complemented by some technical assistance with NUCA, so the New Urban Cities Authority here, as well as the 6 October City themselves. So we cooperated with the private sector, but also with the government to provide technical assistance on environmental challenges and on gender inclusion. There are other private sector deals that we've got underway at the moment, another dry port and a desalination plant, all of those public-private partnerships. And I guess the question is, what can we as MDBs do to foster the private sector engagement? Because let's face it, the capital of even all of our banks together is not going to solve the climate challenge in cities. And I think one of the things that we're all doing is fostering the public-private partnership approach to finance, both with technical side and legal side. And through EBRD Green Cities, we also have these Green City action plans, and all of the actions in those, we work with not just co-financiers from the other MDBs, but also with private sector to identify where the potential is for investment action to be invested and have investments from the private sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Nigel. And so we've heard about cooperation amongst MDBs with the private sector, so I now want to move on to Stephen from the European Investment Bank. You've been working very closely with city networks in your approach to climate action and with local governments. So we'd like to hear a bit from you, building on what you've heard from colleagues before about your approach to working with city networks and what's the added value of doing that. Thank you.
Hi, can you hear me? Yep. I might spin this up here actually. Yeah, so EIB has a very good and close working relationship with the city networks. That's both inside and outside the EU. For example, inside the EU we work with Eurocities and the Council for European Municipalities and Regions. And outside the EU, for example, we work with C40 and the Global Covenant of Mayors and I always get this acronym wrong, ICLEI, which is the sustainability group. And we see them as being very valuable, actually, very valuable indeed. And I would say, I think I speak on behalf of all of my MDB colleagues here. I would say that, you know, there's a true partnership building with the city networks and between all of us. One initiative where that's especially the case, I think, is the City Climate Gap Fund. And this is where we provide early stage, upfront technical support for developing countries in preparing climate smart urban projects. And I would say this is a true partnership because, of course, we're implementing it with the World Bank. And in fact, it was the Covenant of Mayors that pointed out that there was a gap in the project cycle that needed to be filled. And this is the very purpose of the GAP Fund, is to go right in early stage and help them prepare the projects. So what we're doing with the World Bank at the moment is, I think we created a partnership forum. And this provides a space where the city networks and donors and other partners can get together and discuss you know, some of the key horizontal themes that are relevant for project preparation, capacity building, knowledge sharing, lessons learned, all these kinds of things, and I think that works well. And on the EIB side, actually with funding from the German and the Luxembourg governments, we are implementing the GAP Fund through a partnership with GIZ. And here we've set up a specific collaboration with ICLEI. And the purpose of this is to set up a community of practice, if you like, for selected cities that have accessed the funds for help and support beyond the end of the GAP work, so through into project preparation and implementation. I think this provides a forum, again, for knowledge sharing and so on and so forth. So I think it's working really well.
Thank you, Stephen. And we're very happy to collaborate with EIB on the City Climate Gap Fund. And we welcome people to apply to that. Cities can apply directly on the EIB or World Bank joint website for the Gap Fund. Thank you. And over to Graham from the Inter-American Development Bank. And we've heard now about city networks. We want to hear about cities, and they're obviously at the forefront of action in your region, and we'd love to hear about your work with cities on climate change. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for the opportunity. I'd just start off by pointing out why we have to work with cities in Latin America. Over 80% of people actually live in cities in Latin America, so that's a fairly obvious reason, but 80% of the disaster losses actually happen in cities as well. So that's the second big reason. And what's interesting also, we're increasingly seeing rural migration being driven by disasters in rural areas to cities, which then exacerbates the disaster issues in cities because most of those people move to informal areas. For that reason, we set up some time ago a cities network to have discussions with mayors about how we can help and what we can do to advance, but probably more importantly, so that the mayors themselves can share information about what each of the groups is doing. Some quick lessons learned on that in terms of looking at mitigation issues. Buildings comes out as being super important. They're about 5 to 15% of the total emissions from the region, and they use about 50% of the electricity in the region. So you have not just the direct uses, but also embodied emissions in cement and steel that need to be addressed directly. So we have a series of efforts that are looking at energy efficiency, electrification of buildings, building standards and changing building standards in cities, rooftop solar. So a series of initiatives trying to drive that, to deal with that particular problem set. Urban transportation is a super important agenda as well for Latin America. We have some of the highest per capita bus usage in the world, interestingly enough. So we're already sort of moving in the right direction. But we still have about 15% of emissions, of lack emissions, coming from transportation systems. And we project that this is probably going to more than triple before 2050. So it becomes a huge area that we need to work in. Focus there is reducing individual transportation, trying to create more public walking spaces, riding spaces, a little bit following the model of European cities. We still have extensive BRT systems, and trying to make sure that those are all electrified is key as well. So a lot of work on urban design, urban mobility. We just approved a GCF program for electromobility, which will focus mainly on BRT systems throughout the region as well. And then on digital technologies and how you can apply that. Third big area, waste management. Often forgotten in terms of emissions, but it's about 6% of emissions. We do not have circular economies. We are very far away from that. In general, 5% of municipal waste is actually recycled, so it's pretty low. We also waste about 1/3 of the food in Latin America and the Caribbean, which is a huge issue because that wasted food is then going to landfills and then creating methane emissions from the landfills. So again, a very heavy focus on reducing food loss, food waste, and methane management. On the adaptation side, I've already said that they've got huge impacts in cities, but you have slow onset impacts as well as disastrous impacts. You have water scarcity issues starting to appear. Heat is going to be a huge problem for many cities, for workers in cities. We're already seeing it. And then coastal cities, where a lot of the cities sit, you've got sea level rise, which is then going to be doubled up with increasing hurricanes and storms. It's very complicated, as I mentioned at the beginning, by the fact that you've got migration to cities and very rapid urban growth. You have informal settlements that need to be managed, that make it even more complex. So we do a lot of work in those informal settlements to try and order those settlements, make them formal so that they can be managed. But often they appear in the most vulnerable parts of cities, or most vulnerable areas of cities. So that's a major a major problem. The question there is, how do you build institutional capacities for cities so that they can manage that? How do you build governance, transversal governance into cities? How can you set up planning, zoning, and regulations that will control these kinds of issues? The questions of building standards, and then the full, I don't want to use the word full Monty to show that I'm British, but on the question of risk assessment and how you move that agenda forward. We're also working extensively on infrastructure programs, particularly on nature-based solutions and how you can apply those in cities. So just to quickly summarize, I would say the reason we have the network is to try and bring the leaders together, because the leaders are key. And just the same way as a national level, you need that leadership to drive it transversally throughout the whole city. Governance is also critical, and we often find that if you think you've got problems at a national level with institutional capacities, at subnational levels that becomes even more critical. So that becomes a huge challenge. And the coordination becomes a challenge between the national and the subnational, and making sure that that's effective work. Having said that, many cities in Latin America actually have very ambitious net zero goals. Many cities have actually very good adaptation plans. The challenge is, how do we share the information and the innovation so that we can actually move the needle and implement across cities? And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Graham. I think you emphasized clearly the point of also cities uniting in this challenge, and it sounds like a lot of lessons for this African continent as well. Yeah. So let me pass now to Anup from IFC, and perhaps you can share with us, we've heard how we need to unite in Africa for climate change, and it would be good to hear from you perhaps some innovations or an example of an innovation that you can give from IFC's work. Thank you.
Sure, thank you, Joanna. And happy to be on this panel with MDB colleagues. As Mike said, we've got a fantastic group here, and we do need to scale up solutions for the cities. At the same time, as Nigel was saying, we can't bring that capital. We need the private sector and the public sector to come in. So there's a lot to be done. There is, I was thinking of the phrase you often hear, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. We've got to do both of these. We've got to go fast and far. And so we've really got to challenge that adage a bit. And we've had a fantastic working relationship focused on cities amongst the MDBs. And so welcome this conversation. When we look at the African context, over 70% of the cities, small cities, are exposed to climate risks, whether it's sea level rise, flooding, extreme heat. So we've got to find solutions. And so many of you may be familiar with IFC's EDGE tool, which started on green buildings. We've brought that innovation now to the cities using the APEX tool, which we partnered with our bank colleagues on. And if some of you got a chance to attend a panel on Alexandria a couple of days ago, you would have seen how that tool can really help cities to create a green city plan. So to Graham's point, the net zero goals, many times cities don't know where to start, what to do about it. And it's this tool that can help them, which is essentially a cloud-based platform that harnesses insights on green opportunities. And there are several examples I can use. And if you saw that Alexandria presentation, it was very clear they'd identified exactly the areas where they could reduce GHG emissions, by how much %. And that allows the city to focus on those different aspects. And this tool looks at the built environment, transport, waste, and water, all the key different areas for cities, and then comes up with policy measures that a city can take, as well as concrete projects, because that's what it boils down to at the end of the day. We as MDBs finance on the private sector side and public sector side concrete projects, something that can bring change at the city level and galvanize finance into those. So, and there are several other examples that are in place right now. In South Africa, Ekurhuleni, where they've developed a green city action plan using this. We've got in Ho Chi Minh City, they use that tool for public transportation focus. Almaty to identify potential investments. Lima, Medellin, Cape Town, Quezon City, they're all ongoing using that tool to scale up. So I think at the end of the day, while we have these goals, bringing this innovative tool to help the cities clearly define what they should be doing and how to translate that into projects will be key. And that's where we're looking to bring this innovation through Apex. Okay.
Thank you, Anup, and thanks for bringing up Apex. It was launched here on Sunday at the COP, and we're working together with our colleagues at IFC to scale that up to, we have a dozen cities now, but we hope to scale it up to at least 100 in the next 5 years. So look forward to work with you on that. But you talked about concrete projects. So I wanted to move to Nicholas and hear about some examples of how do we take it to scale, and with using some concrete examples of projects that we have together in Africa with the other IDBs. And also, what are the challenges and opportunities? I think we heard that we should do it. We want to unite, we want to work together more, but what are the challenges and opportunities for scaling up climate action? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Joanna, and I'm very glad to be here with so many distinguished colleagues from other MDBs to reflect how we can step up our game for climate. Many panelists already mentioned the thematic area of public transportation, and I think that's a really good example to think about how we can build on already quite strong collaboration, but I think we can do more. And the needs are, it's certainly an area where the needs are enormous. We know the figures. Africa has passed the point where more Africans are living in cities. We expect 1 billion more African coming into half a billion more African living in cities in the coming 25 years. And some countries like Niger, like Tanzania, like Burkina Faso have a urbanization rate of almost 5%. No? So the challenge is enormous. Every African city today has a congestion problem, and they are turning to us to ask for, can you help us with some solutions? No? And that's where some of the work that we've been doing on public transportation, bringing the BRT model from other regions, in particular the LAC region, I think is something we need to continue pushing. At the World Bank 10 years ago, we just had one BRT project in Africa in our portfolio. That was the Lagos BRT. Today we have 14. So just to give a bit of a scale of how this is ramping up, and obviously we need to do much more. Perhaps one very concrete example of this new generation of BRT project that we are financing and we are partnering to finance is the Dakar BRT. This is an operation that was prepared jointly by several development partners, including EIB, the bank, the African Development Bank. We were able to bring some financing from the Green Climate Fund. We worked with IFC on the structuring of the PPP so that we could attract private financing. $150 million of private financing are expected for that project. BRTs are nice because they are not only good for climate, they are good for countries, for air pollution, but also for accessibility. One of my favorite indicators of how BRT can contribute to the development of a particular city is the accessibility to jobs. Now, what's the percentage of jobs in a particular city that are accessible within an hour of commute? And in the case of Dakar, we expect an increase of 11% of the jobs that will be accessible within an hour of commute. In Abidjan, it's going to be even more than 50%. We were able also to measure how social services, access to hospital will be facilitated. So there is a real development story and a double dividend both on climate, on air pollution, and on development. BRT projects are large projects, so they are complex, and so it's actually quite rare that we go alone. So it's a good area of partnership because usually we have 2, 3, sometimes 4 development partners around the table to work on those. So it's typically the kind of operations where we need to talk one to another to see how we, not only in terms of co-financing, but also bringing at the policy level. There are a lot of complex policy challenges around public transportation. There is how you deal with informal transporters, how you set up institutions, transit authorities, how you work to introduce e-mobility, potentially electric buses. And I'm very glad that on this panel we have the representative from IDB, whose primary focus is not Africa, but there are an enormous amount of lessons from Latin America that are relevant for Africa. LAC cities are championing active mobility, are championing electric buses. The BRT model was invented in LAC, so the South-South partnership is also very relevant. Yeah, so I'll stop there. It's certainly one area where the sky is the limit. We need also to expand the frontier of our public transportation program, not only in capital cities, but also developing a solution for mid-sized cities. For example, we are financing a new BRT in the city of Kumasi, the second city of Ghana. This a bit of a new generation of that is customized to the specific needs of secondary cities, and yeah, there's so much that we can do together in this area, and so looking forward to continue building on our partnership in public transportation.
Thank you, Nicholas. And I think, as you say, the BRT is an excellent example of us being forced to work together because the financing is just not enough. And also to learn from other regions, LAC in particular on the transport side is something that we probably need to do more of. But you also mentioned, how to take these things to scale, and I know that's something on the transport side you're working on. But I believe also you touched on something which is important to mention here is also the integration across sectors. So the integration of urban and transport planning that will be needed for the kind of compact city development, for cities to be climate resilient, but also livable, proximity to jobs you mentioned, and resilient to climate change. So thanks for raising that. And I would suggest we have another go around the panel if we can, and just reflecting on what we've heard here. What do we really need to do to take this to scale? We know that the pace and the speed and the volume of financing is critical now. We don't have a lot of time to get urbanization right, but we have an opportunity to do it well. So I'd love to hear from you, Mike, first, some reflections and perspective, and take your time. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I think we've had a lot of solutions here on the panel. From the African Development Bank perspective, what we're doing is, that for some of you will have heard, the president of the bank, Adesina, has made a commitment to mobilize 25 billion for adaptation over the next 5 years. That's the bar for us. That's where we're going to work towards to reach and mobilize this. But we know we can mobilize alone. It's not just for the African Development Bank. That's the target we set. So all of us here have to work towards mobilizing this 25 billion. And I'm happy that my colleagues here have mentioned a lot of initiatives that can help to that. But concretely, we have 3 ways of addressing this. One is upstream work. There was issue of policy that my colleague from the World Bank just mentioned. It's critical. In an environment like this, because urban development is territorial, it's not sectorial. It cuts across many sectors. Then you need an enabling environment, you need a good policy environment and regulation to really get this done. So we are supporting countries through our policy work to really have that enabling environment, but we like to do it together. Because at the end of the day, we're all implementing projects in the same space. So the earlier we come together upstream, at the very upstream, the better it is for us to do downstream work. So that I would like to engage my colleague here further on that particular thing. So for us, we are just approve what we call a sub-national financing policy at the bank. Because unless we capacitate the cities, they will not be able to really borrow or invest at the rate, at the scale that is required. National budget is very limited. If cities are not capacitated financially to be able to go to the market, have their rating correct, and their policies right, they will not be able to meet the financing gap that is. So I think this is one of another area where we have collectively have to provide capacity to cities to really upgrade their financial stance so that they can be able to even sometimes borrow directly from us, but also go to market and engage private sector. So I'll be keen to hear what my colleagues are doing in this area of sub-national financing. The third element for us on the upstream work is the instrument that we have. UMDF is the Urban Municipality Development Fund. My colleague Marcus Meyer is here. He's the coordinator and manager for the fund. It's a fund by which it's a fund that's growing, but it's very useful to unlock opportunity in investment. That's the, EIB just mentioned the gap funding that they have with the World Bank. We have similar thing, but we can bring those funds together to do things at scale. So Marcus will be engaging on this one. At the midstream level, where we really have to help to bring projects to stream, whether it's a PPP project in the cities or public sector financing project, countries or cities, they need capacity to prepare those projects. So we have capacity building and project preparation facilities that can help to do that. Now, on the downstream level, there are 2 initiatives that the bank is promoting right now. It's something we call the climate action window, which is, because the cost of building climate resilience in cities is very high. And already we are struggling to finance a normal project because of the gap. So if you add the climate resiliency to it, the cost escalate quickly. And if you find, people, the country have to make a choice in resource allocation. There are alternative use for funding. So if you ask him, instead of doing a road project, add a drainage to cater for the issue of drought and so forth, it costs money in the design and the material. That they have difficulty in accepting those kind of things because at the same time they need to build hospital, they need to build educational system. So that incremental cost need to be financed. So we are promoting this climate action window to be able to mobilize additional resources and support countries to do that, to fight for adaptation and climate-proof the investment so that infrastructure in Africa lasts longer than what is currently the case. We don't have the luxury in Africa to have infrastructure that lasts 20 years. You do a road today, 20 years, not even 20 years, 5 years, 2 or 3 rains, the road is gone. And that's the cost because they need to come back to me, to you, to all of you here for another lending to rehabilitate that road or build a new road. So the cost of funding infrastructure is very high unless we build climate resiliency. So that's one thing, the climate action window, which we are promoting to mobilize resources. It's about in the region of between 2 to 3 billion that we want to mobilize. The other one, which we launched here at the COP27, is the Alliance for Green Infrastructure in Africa. It's called AGIA. AGIA is trying to do what we're trying to do at the city level, IDEA is doing the same thing at the national level, is to bring the like-minded institutions like ourselves together to do things at scale and at speed, is to promote climate-friendly projects, crowd in private sector, that's the difference. And I'm glad that Anup is here from IFC, is to crowd in private sector. So this is a kind of alliance that we need to build to really do things at scale and fast. So AGIA and the climate action window for the bank are two critical things we're trying to do to mobilize downstream financing and promote infrastructure. Just to conclude, two other projects with, where we are working with the World Bank on is the BRT in Abidjan. It's a huge project, as you said. One cannot do it alone. So we are partnering with the World Bank to do this mega, urban development projects in Abidjan, which we believe is going to change Abidjan. For some of you who know Abidjan, it's a very crowded city, high mobility, and we need to do this kind of urban project to really unlock the city and bring in innovation and also investment. So I think this is a very good demonstration of what we can do when we come together. We can do powerful things, and I really want this to continue. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. And I heard the call there for 25 billion for adaptation in Africa as the call from the AFDB. And you highlighted, obviously, the need for subnational financing and also the need to finance this additional cost for the resilience efforts. So thank you. Let me put the same question to Nigel. How are we going to scale up this challenge? Thanks.
Right, thank you, Joanna. And I couldn't agree more with Mike's point. I guess I would like to start with the collaboration and cooperation point again. I think we have to go far, and so we have to go together, to draw on that quote. I think that is kind of for me, the one-liner from this event. And that's collaboration across MDBs, but also collaboration with the private sector, with the cities, with city networks. So that for me is critical. And then in terms of the collaboration, I've got these three things that I tend to say in the acronym of ACT. The first one is in terms of action planning to prioritize, whether that's our Green City Action Plans or the EDGE tool or whatever other multiple tools you have. We've got so much to do, so limited capacity and capital that we've got to make sure that we prioritize, particularly in the short to medium term. So that prioritization for me seems absolutely critical. The C is for the capacity, and it's been mentioned several times by my colleagues here. The capacity not just of city clients, but also of stakeholders, the civil society who are involved in all of the investments that we engage in. It's so important that the capacity is built so that they and we can work together to deliver the billions and trillions of investment. The capacity, the other area is the capacity of policymakers. Mike and others have mentioned the need for policy intervention, so critical to essentially enable our investments. I call it investment grade policy. And finally, the T is for targeted finance. Yes, there's a lot of capital around, but it needs to be targeted in a way that's effective. And this is what the things like the Gap Fund are doing, is helping to target finance to bankable projects. Thank you.
Thanks, Nigel. Over to you, Stephen, for your perspective. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Couldn't agree more with my two colleagues here. And actually, I was just listening to Professor Rockstrom actually talking in the EU Pavilion about tipping points. That's in a biodiversity context, but the two things are inextricably linked. And don't want to be too alarmist, but there's clearly some very serious issues, and we're approaching some of these tipping points. So, scale and speed is imperative. I mean, at EIB, we're kind of looking at three main areas. The first is to broaden and mainstream those technical solutions that we already have to some extent. And Anup talked very eloquently there about the EDGE tool earlier, and just big pat on the back for that, because that's an excellent facility, and we're using that as well. And we actually used it first 5 years ago in Botswana and Namibia in some of our affordable housing programs there. And we're trying to mainstream that in all of our projects now. And at the moment we're working in Kenya and Colombia, and we're rolling out the Edge tool there as well. So thank you very much for that, indeed. The second area is that we ought to make best use of financial intermediaries and in-country local development agencies as well to spread the word, if you like, for some of these good practices. And one of the things we're doing at the moment is working with the Tunisian Urban Rehabilitation and Renovation Agency, and actually co-financing with AFD and the Commission there. And this is about developing the resilience of small and medium-sized towns, and that's working very well. And it's about spreading the word. And this is actually the third financing that we've done in that respect. So. And then we're really trying to scale it up across the country as a whole. So that's really important for us. And then the third and last area is really, we kind of get fixated as institutions sometimes on making sure that we get operations through our hierarchies and signed and approved, but actually there's a lot to do with the project beyond that. And so, we really need to make sure that we concentrate on implementation. And if we can support our promoters in making sure that things are taken forward through the procurement and then the construction and the implementation phase. So that's a key area as well. And for that very reason is why we as an institution have set up what we call EIB Global, which is the part of the group will focus specifically on making sure that our operations outside the union are taken forward and implemented to the best of our ability. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. So we've heard about the sort of bigger picture vision from Mike. From Nigel, we heard about the need to act, to have action plans, build capacity, but also to prioritize with steely vision what we need to do. And from Stephen, we heard about the need to set up, delivery mechanisms and work with financial intermediaries and other agencies in country that can really take this to scale. Thank you. Graham, love to hear your perspective. What are we missing?
So I'm not sure I'm going to add a huge amount to what's already been said. I mean, for Latin America and the Caribbean, there is a huge dependence on central government transfers for cities. So our main modus operandi is very similar to others in terms of doing subnational support through sovereign guarantees, but then also working through financial intermediaries is also key as well, with credit lines for national or even subnational development banks. We believe that there's also space to expand the work that we're doing on improving access to capital markets for subnationals. And we have been looking at that with mixed success. For example, in an effort we did in Mexico, we found actually that the cost of capital wasn't changed very much so by doing green bonds at a subnational level. So therefore, at the end of the day, they just went for commercial, simply because it wasn't much of a benefit. But in other countries, it actually could make a difference. So we're exploring that. And then, of course, you can use blended finance to encourage private investment, particularly in areas of housing and buildings in cities as well. So that's kind of the standard operating procedures that we're moving with. We're also looking at some more, I would say, a little bit more innovative stuff. Some of that is that we can more effectively, in a programmatic way, access, for example, GCF funds, concessional funds, and bring those concessional funds to play at a subnational level. Both of our last two GCF programs have actually been for subnationals. So one of them was the Amazon Initiative, which is focusing on what we're doing with governors in not just in Brazil, but across the whole of the region. And that actually is quite effective, and at a governor level you're getting actually much more traction. And of course the governors are dealing directly with municipalities, so that's the connection there. And then our electromobility program is done for cities directly. So they were trying to get the access to concession finance directly to the cities. Those are interesting. We'll see how those play out and see what lessons we can learn from that. A second area is actually connecting into philanthropic funds and creating dedicated funds that work with cities or work with subnationals. And again, there's a lot of examples from the Amazon. There's a lot of discussion here at the COP about creating these kinds of funds that can actually help. Ultimately, those are going to go to municipalities. That's where the rubber hits the road, is at that level. It's not It's not really a national issue. It's something that has to change at a municipal level. But then there's also, examples for Rockefeller, WRI. There's a lot of interest in actually moving the needle in that agenda. So I think we could work together to build that kind of channeling. We need to calculate how much it's worth and make sure that it's the transactional costs don't outweigh what we're going to deliver, but it's an interesting area of work. And then, of course, a lot of our work directly, because our focus is on poverty and addressing the major issues, is actually on the peripheral areas of cities. These areas where migrants are moving into the cities, in the informal areas, and trying to improve those. So a lot of our work is directly focused on informality, trying to sort out some of these issues in cities where you've got people living in areas that are highly susceptible to natural disasters, flooding, and those kinds of things. So coming back a little bit, and I like your ACT thing, what the MDBs can do, and I think you can take the model that we do at a national level and apply it at a subnational level. That first and foremost what we need is subnational leadership. And interestingly enough, you have it in many, I don't know if you've popped over to see what's happening over in Amazon. I don't know, I shouldn't call that whole area the Amazon area, but it's the governors that are talking there. So it's the governors that are moving, that's subnational. So I think that leadership is critical, and we should work with that leadership to move the agenda forward. We also have that leadership in cities. Some of the best leaders in Latin America are actually the mayors of cities. So I think we need to take advantage of that. But what they need is to actually think about doing a long-term strategy for a city or for a region. They need to think through these issues long-term. It needs to be transversal. So when you change the mayor from one government to the next, it doesn't all get lost and you don't all go backwards. And so we need long-term thinking, transversal thinking at the city level. And that's not easy. You need to build capacity to do that. They need support to do that, to be able to move the agenda forward. We've actually done one in João Pessoa in Brazil, where we've actually tried to move this agenda forward. So we're looking at it. But then the question is, how do the banks do that? Because we're not going to help every single city. There are too many of them. We struggle to help the countries, let alone the cities. So what is the mechanism that we can put in place to actually do that? Another interesting area is, how do we get bankable projects? How do we get pipelines of bankable projects to actually move forward? And there we have a couple of experiences. One is that in Brazil, we've worked with basically a sustainable infrastructure observatory, which is a national level process, but it's focused on cities. It's focused on how do you deliver infrastructure to cities, but how do you connect the infrastructure pipelines that are in cities to potential ESG investors. Countries are aware in Latin America that there's a lot of money out there. The question is, how can we connect the investors to the actual projects? We've also done something similar with Banobras in Brazil, in Mexico, where we've done similar, preparing the projects, but then actually analyzing them using a sustainable infrastructure framework, so you can say to the investors, look, we're hitting this button, this button, this button, this button. This project is probably going to fit with your criteria to move the agenda forward. And so accelerating the investment connection. And then my final comment is more from a climate perspective. In Latin America, if 80% of people are living in cities, which we know they are, if you want to move the national agenda forward, you're going to have to move the city agenda forward. What people are going to look for in cities is greener cities, happier people, less time spent in traffic jams, not being polluted every time you walk in the streets, trees which make people happier. I mean, I can keep going on, but green cities are actually the way to win the national agenda. So we really need to move forward the agenda in the cities so that we can actually move forward the national agenda and actually get where we want to get in terms of national development and making people's lives better. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Graham. Really great intervention, looking at the need for long-term leadership and capacity in cities, but also linking cities with finance, both philanthropic, concessional, but also private capital markets. So I think it's a good segue over to Anoop and IFC for your perspective on scaling city climate action.
Thank you, Joanna. So I want to just touch on a few things on finance, especially since Mike also talked about it and how IFC. So in 2000 we did our first subnational loan with Casablanca with AFD and without a sovereign guarantee, which was kind of a breakthrough for us. And in general, we've got a number of PPPs going that kind of aim to bridge the financing gap by bringing the public and private sector in. We have the Dakar Rapid Transit that was mentioned. There's a Kigali bulk water supply that we're working on. In Morocco, there's an irrigation-related PPP. And so we've got a number of PPPs going. We've been able to successfully leverage blended finance in several situations. I use the example of Serbia and Belgrade. We did a waste management project where we were able to use blended finance to extend tenors and lower the cost of financing, which was extremely helpful for the project because the repayment. So I think bringing in blended finance in a significant way will help us advance some of this agenda. We've got the other aspect is sustainably linked finance. So what we are seeing is, and we did a couple of projects in the last year on linking certain metrics to a reduction in the rate of pricing. And that has been effective in getting some targets on reach, whether it's water supply or building resilience. And so it comes back, I think, to a humbling moment I had in a panel on housing where we were discussing housing, and I had on the panel with me somebody from a young youth from the Slum Dwellers International. And while we were talking of affordable housing, she showed the photo of a shanty town. And we need to do a lot more. And we've seen that the rural-urban migration issue is significant, and it's not new. I look back to a development economics class 35 years ago that talked about the rural-urban migration, and it's just been that way. Just from the expected income in a city for somebody living in a rural area, even if you don't have a job for several days or months, the expected income at the end of the day that you continue to have that migration, and we're seeing that. We're just seeing cities grow everywhere. And I think the other photo that I vividly remember from that panel was she put out reimagining the communities. And I think that's what we need to do, and reimagine how we want to scale this, reimagine what partnerships we bring in, reimagine how we actually want to deliver solutions for the cities.
Thank you, Anup. Really great intervention. And I also had a humbling experience over in the local government pavilion. We had colleagues from Kenyan cities, and they said, sometimes we feel the MDBs aren't listening, or we talk different languages, but I can hear now that they are listening to the cities, and they're really excited and looking forward to us finding ways to work better with them too. Nicholas, lastly, but hopefully wrap up this round on scaling up climate finance for cities. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. These are all great comments, and I have not much to add. Perhaps two points. Now, one very concrete. It's if we want to be effective in joining our forces, I think it has to go beyond us sitting in a panel today for 1 hour, because this is great and we can see all the energy and the willingness to join our efforts. But what is even more effective is when we bring our teams together. When the operational teams from the respective organizations periodically meet, exchange on strategy, exchange on pipeline, where there are opportunities for co-financing, to join forces. We used to have that around the General Assembly of the Sub-Saharan Africa Transport Policy Program, SSATP. Every year we used to meet, and COVID disrupted this quite a lot. So now I think it could be a good moment to restart, and we would be very happy to extend invitations to all of you to see if we can resume this periodic conversation now. The second thing, because that will allow us, I think, to also for our teams to get to know one another, because if you want to work together, you need to know each other, and that's during these meetings, during these moments, that we can build those this team spirit. But there is another issue where I think we need to push harder, which is the policy agenda, no? Because all these big investment projects somehow will find a way to do them. No, they are too big for one financier to be able to handle them. So we need to collaborate. We'll find ways to jointly make them happen. What is more complicated is those policy reforms that need to move the needle. And one example that keeps me awake at night is motorization in Africa. You know, there are 1 billion cars in the world today. There will be 3 billion by 2050. And the curve in developing countries is like that, and in Africa it's like that, no? So Africa has to rethink the way it's doing its motorization, and that implies working on multiple angles, no? How to regulate the trade of used vehicles, how to introduce incentives so that the transporters can modernize the fleet. And there are some lessons that can be brought from India, for example, no? Who is now developing a huge program to incentivize the transition to e-mobility through blended finance and risk-sharing facilities. And perhaps at some point, this is a model that could be relevant for Africa. So I feel we need to engage more in this area, and perhaps, yeah, this could be another topic to be put on the agenda of those meetings that we could re-establish now that COVID is a bit more behind us, no? Thank you.
Thank you, Nicholas. Very practical, down to business, getting the teams together in country to collaborate. Thank you. So we have time now for questions or comments or interventions. If anyone would like to come in, I'm sure the panel would welcome that. Yeah, I'm going to have to.
Hello, thank you so much, panel. I'm Davina from the African Development Bank. Just to compliment Mike, that we also have a circular economy facility. A lot of the work that you talk about decarbonizing the cities link around decoupling emissions with solutions. So we also have, with that we have a facility. You talked a lot about policy support. We have a facility on circular support for countries to do circular roadmaps, circular economy roadmaps, as well as business development for SMEs in circular space. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yeah?
Thank you. My name's Hannah. I'm a law student in the U.S. I was wondering how, this isn't a question for any of you, how to address the issue of creditworthiness of cities in sub-Saharan Africa that either have a low or below grade credit rating, and how that might affect the need to urgently scale up finance.
Anoop, would you like to take it?
Sure, thank you for that question. And it's municipal finance is an area we've been looking at for several years now, and it's, I mentioned blended finance. So this is where we try to get a donor partner, a philanthropic or a country government to take a certain layer of the risk that is often the first loss. And because the credit ratings are often difficult. Separately, we have a program, we've been working with many of these municipalities to improve their credit ratings. So, you know, we've got that in the agri side, we've got that in some of the municipal side, to work with some of these municipalities to help them better manage their finances and be credit worthy. So there are two different approaches. One is more a capacity building side to help them see how they manage. Now, there are some regulatory changes needed as well, because in several places, local municipalities cannot borrow in the international markets or from banks. They are covered by state law or country law. And so there's some need for regulatory change there. But essentially, it's blended finance instruments that can allow for certain de-risking for the private sector to come into that.
Thank you so much for the nice discussion. This is Ahmed Wafi. I'm private consultant, energy and environment. My question here is, since we are tackling cities in Africa, we usually will come to the adaptation part, so that many of the projects that we need to do are related to adaptation. For example, we developed before a climate change strategy for one of the governorates in Egypt. This was one of the first climate change strategies on the city level in Africa. And of course, we found out that many projects are adaptation, and we were very confused about whether the development banks can be interested to fund such type of projects. So I would like to hear your thoughts about that. Thank you so much.
Nigel, would you like to take it?
Can you hear me, Echo? Yeah, okay. So perhaps I can start. I'm sure my other colleagues have got things to say as well. Great question, and there's no doubt about it that adaptation now has to be a priority for us in, given the current circumstances. We are doing two things, I think, with the adaptation investment, three things. First of all, we're pursuing adaptation investment projects in and of themselves. So we have some projects that focus only on adaptation. These usually are related to flood defense. The other thing we're doing was we're trying to mix adaptation components into broader projects. So every project we look at now as part of our Paris alignment screening needs to look at building blocks 2, the adaptation element, and identify the physical climate risks. And where those are identified, we have to build into the project elements of mitigation of those risks, so the adaptation component. That's the second thing. And the third thing we're doing is building capacity. And that capacity, incidentally, is not just external to the bank, but internally. We have a lot of bankers who are still trying to get their head around what adaptation means in terms of their investments when they're marketing to clients, but also adaptation capacity building at the local level and at the government, central government level, about making sure that those are priorities. Those are just some things we're doing at EBRD. I'm sure my colleagues have other things.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think I will add the same thing that my colleague from EBRD have said. At the bank, we also have a standalone adaptation program, but more importantly, we're trying to mainstream adaptation into regular projects. That's what I mentioned, and that's precisely what my colleague from EBRD has mentioned. And this is done to build climate resiliency in those projects. And that's what we're doing. Now, we are even saying that countries must understand or be able to identify the risk, adaptation risk, so that we can better design projects. So we are partnered with the GCA, a Global Center for Adaptation, in a program called AAAP, Accelerated Africa Adaptation Program, which is really helping to identify the risk assessment for climate resiliency. And that helps us to build climate resilient projects. So this is one of the ways that we do.
I can add that our Paris alignment approach for all of us, of course, takes us in that same direction to integrate adaptation into the projects. But just separately, I talked about Apex and Edge. We have a building resilience tool also we've developed that at the building level you can assess resilience for the particular asset, and very similar to the Edge and Apex tools that we're working on.
Perhaps just a few compliments on the adaptation agenda. First, it is very important in our current business. For example, at the World Bank, our transport portfolio is $36 billion. 60% of that brings climate co-benefits, and it's half mitigation and half adaptation. So the adaptation is really a big part of what we do. Three dimensions in the transport sector. One is adapting construction standards so that infrastructure are more climate resilient. Two, looking at networks. There are a number of countries in Africa which are critically dependent on only one road, one access to connect to the rest of the world, to connect to the sea for landlocked countries. So when something happens on that particular corridor, then they become completely isolated. So thinking resilience in terms of network is also very important. And the third point is the critical importance of asset management, and in particular maintenance of infrastructure. One consequence that we anticipate with climate change is that the cost of road maintenance in Africa is going to triple in the coming decade. And this will force countries to rethink the way they implement and they finance maintenance. Right now, many African countries have set up those road maintenance funds that have been dimensioned for a specific adaptation and a maintenance challenge. That challenge is going to be tripled in the near future now. So how do we anticipate and how do we prepare for those evolution? And I think it's really a good moment to, that brings us back again to this issue of policy. How do we help African countries build those maintenance mechanisms, those maintenance institutions that will allow them to adapt their infrastructure and prepare for the challenges ahead.
I think we can just take one more question, if that's okay. I didn't see who.
Yes, thank you. Marvin Nusek from Circle Economy, and actually tomorrow we're going to launch a roadmap for international financial institutions with many of your colleagues, or at least your institutions. And what we've learned in this process is that a lot of the multilateral development banks face actually problems by identifying circular projects. So I'm wondering to what extent that is also an issue in climate action in general, and to what extent your institutions are also trying to support to mature potential investments. And if you have any tips for circular projects to also be more matured to be investable. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question, very important. I mean, at the EIB, we try and look at every project through a circular lens, and you might know that it's one of the 4 environmental objectives of the EU taxonomy, alongside water and pollution and biodiversity. So we've been doing that for many years now, and we try and share experience and knowledge on this as well. So it's like adaptation, and I hope the questioner there got a sense of how key adaptation is for us. I think circular economy would be the same for us all as well.
Just quickly, I mean, yeah, we completely agree, and in fact, we're part of the group that's moving with the baseline for Latin America and the Caribbean, and as I said during the presentation, we don't have a circular economy in Latin America, so there's plenty of space to move. And it is going to be one of the driving forces for our own investments. And I wanted to come back to the issue of policy support, that ultimately I think we all need to be aware that the MDBs are not going with their investments to solve all the problems. The percentage that for Latin America and the Caribbean, just to give you an idea, we calculated that we need between 470 billion and 1.3 trillion annually to Paris align everything. We deliver 6 to 7 billion of that. And I think the point was made earlier that the real change occurs when you leverage off the projects to change policies. So we can do model projects that then the policymakers can see the benefits of those types of projects and actually start changing the policies. And I think that's particularly important when you come back to the city level. So a lot of this is about municipal waste management. If we want circular economy to work, then it's going to have to work at a municipal level. But we first need to support some projects to make sure that we can move the agenda forward. And just to repeat, I mean, there's a whole bunch of issues also about food waste that have to come into that. And in particular, it could be a very quick win, given the methane emissions that come from badly managed systems that we have right now. So just that comment.
Yeah, just briefly to mention that from the African Development Bank perspective, we just approved a strategy on circular economy, and my colleague Davina is here, so she's expert in that regard. I'm sure you can have some bilateral with her. But in the transport sector, what we're trying to do is this issue of asset recycling. You know, if you look at the railway, for instance, many railway companies, they have asset lying idle over there. Could be the railway station that is built or some railway line. We're trying to see how can we do asset recycling by coming to reassess those assets. First of all, identify them, value them. Some of them had value that they are completely forgotten. And redesign the use of those abandoned assets so that they can actually be a source of funding, revenue generation for the railway company, which will help their financial position, and we can come now and do some other investment together with them. So that's one way of actually doing asset recycling in the transport sector that we are doing. But my colleague there is an expert. Just one other thing on the issue of maintenance that Nicola raised. Climate change is also affecting the way countries will be financing maintenance going forward. Most of the road funds that we have currently are being funded through a fuel levy. As we are moving to e-mobility, more and more, e-buses, e-cars, and less, fuel-based running cars. So the tax revenue you're going to get from that is going to diminish. So now countries have to think innovatively, how do we want to resource our road funds going forward in the face of climate change, which is having a model shift, from what we know to be fuel-based cars into e-mobility or e-buses or e-cars. So I think this is one of the topics where also us as MDBs, we can strategize and think and trying to advise countries and see how do they make up for that shortfall that we foresee already as a result of climate change. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think the key message here is that we heard on the panel is the whole is greater than the sum of our parts, but not just for financing, also for policy, for technical, for demonstrating new approaches. Just before we wrap up, we have actually a special guest because this MDB is talking to ourselves, so we want to bring in an outside perspective. So we have a special guest, Andy Deacon. He's Executive Director from the Global Covenant of Mayors. So he's going to bring us, hopefully, the city perspective and what MDBs can do.
Thank you, Joanna, and for so skillfully managing an all-male panel and doing roving mic duties at the same time. I also wanted to compliment the panel, those of you in the audience in the room, I don't know if it shows on the webcam, on their strong sock game. I thought bankers had a reputation for being boring, but we're doing pretty well in a nice lineup here. So whoever sent that memo around in advance gets bonus points. But really want to say that we've heard about some of the critical support that's being provided by the MDBs, but I want to highlight some of the challenges that exist for cities. Graham mentioned how important subnational leadership is, and GCOM is ready and poised to work closely with all of you to address cities' key barriers and opportunities. We are, for example, working with CDP to surface key opportunities. City climate action in Africa is critical to achieving climate goals, and we know from data that was reported through CDP's city disclosure mechanisms that in Africa, 53 cities across 22 different countries reported in 2021 and 2022 a total of 181 climate projects for which they're seeking funding. As Stephen mentioned, GCOM helped identify the gap in the project cycle, which has resulted in the excellent GAP fund. And Mike, delighted to hear about the collaboration you propose to scale this kind of support to cities. That's all good work, but cities need more and more quickly if we're really going to deliver on climate targets. And we know that cities are key to meeting those targets as climate emissions are concentrated there. Climate action in cities has the capability to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from buildings, transport, material and waste, and by nearly 90% by 2050, according to the Coalition for Urban Transitions from their work back in 2019. But meeting our shared climate goals and delivering on that ambitious agenda will require accelerating the finance for climate implementation and expanding the supply of climate finance available to cities. I'm sure we've talked about it already. The State of Cities Climate Finance report, supported by the World Bank and some of the other MDBs on the panel, estimates that a total of $384 billion was invested in urban climate finance globally in 2017 and 18, but that falls far below the 5 trillion needed annually. And part of the work that we're doing here leads towards the first ever urban ministerial at a climate COP, which is taking place here tomorrow morning. We're very keen both to make sure that there is a route to deliver on the project pipelines that we hope this new surge, Sustainable Urban Resilience for Future Generations initiative will bring forward. We hope to get national governments interested, and that it's not just a subnational push. So I have high expectations that even by the end of tomorrow, we'll at least have opened some doorways and set up a track to be able to deliver in future. I'm not an elected representative, but I worked for several. And Mayor Sharon Dijksma from Utrecht, who is the representative of all local governments on behalf of the local government and municipal authority constituency to the UN, wasn't available to join you, in part because she's preparing for a meeting with G7 leaders later on this afternoon. So I really want to emphasize that local government leaders are out there trying to put the framework in place. A number of you have referred to the importance of enabling frameworks. But really beyond that, once those are in place, and hopefully very rapidly, we stand ready to work with and engage all of you, in my case, on behalf of the 12,500 signatory cities of the Global Covenant of Mayors, to really deliver on this agenda and rapidly advance deliverable, implementable urban climate action that has the potential to change the lives of so many. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy, and we're just drawing to a close now, so I wanted to thank our panel members for excellent discussion and audience for engaging in conversation. We do have an informal working group on cities at the MDBs, and we'll certainly be reviewing the discussion today and preparing for our next year's COP, hopefully with some advances on the kind of team working that Nicholas mentioned. So thank you very much, and thank you all, and hope you enjoy the rest of the COP. Thank you.